For those of you who were wondering what sparked my first interaction with Greco-Roman history, and more specifically with Rome in general, this video will finally give you the anecdotal information. What started it all? What lit the flame in me that eventually turned me into the Romaboo I am today? Well, it was actually a Franco-Belgian comic book very popular in Europe called Asterix and Obelix. I'm not entirely sure how popular that franchise is in English-speaking countries, especially in the United States, but from what I've heard from my colleague Unreal History, it seems that the Franco-Belgian comic book has started to gain some popularity there in recent years. Now, to what extent we're talking about popularity, I don't really know, but it is at least something, I guess. So, for those of you who don't know the franchise, what is Asterix and Obelix about, and what does it have to do with Rome? Well, Asterix and Obelix is about the story of a Gallic village located in the current region of Brittany in modern France, but with the Gallic village and its characters living during the time of Julius Caesar at the time when he was conquering all of Gaul. Eventually, just like in the real world, Julius Caesar would conquer all of Gaul except for that small village of Gauls that the Romans would fail to conquer. And that was because that village has a secret weapon, a magic potion that grants to the person that drinks the potion superhuman strength and abilities temporarily, thus allowing those Gallic villagers to defeat dozens of Roman legions successively without any problem throughout the course of the comic. The only exception to the magic potion's time limit being for the co-protagonist of the comic, Obelix, who, having fallen into the magic potion cauldron as a child, gained the magic potion's effects permanently. That magic potion was created and prepared by the druid of that Gallic village, Panoramix, with him being the only one who had the secret of the recipe of that magic potion, being the only defense they had against the Romans or any other invader who wanted to conquer the village and obtain the secret of that magic potion. Now, apart from the characters invented for the story that takes place within the Gallic village, that world, although with pop culture inspirations and references to real life, is very far from reflecting reality, something I obviously didn't know when I was a child and first discovered that comic. To begin with, Julius Caesar is emperor here, not dictator or consul, and the Roman Republic is already an empire completely under his control by the time he conquers all of Gaul. The comic is also eternally stuck in the same era that refuses to move forward, similar to franchises like The Simpsons, where the year 50 BCE is the year in which all the Asterix and Obelix stories take place eternally, and this, despite the fact that in reality, by that year, Caesar had not even yet crossed the Rubicon to invade Italy and take power against Pompey the Great. All of this and much more shows us how far removed this story is from reality, being more of a purely fantasy story with vague inspirations from real history, but little else. But hey, at least that comic was the one that introduced me to the Roman Empire, and eventually led me to become the ultimate Romaboo that I am today, even if the Romans are portrayed as villains in that story, as always in these fragile modern times. But what if? What if Asterix and Obelix's village, along with Panoramix and his magic potion, had existed in real life? What monumental changes would that have brought to the history of the West and the world? That's the alternate scenario we are going to explore today. So first, to integrate Asterix and Obelix's village into the real world, we need to give a brief background on the history of that village prior to the comic book events. That village is led by a Gallic chief, which as such functions as a hereditary monarchy, since before the Gallic chief Abrara his father was the chief of that village, and before his father, his grandfather, and before his grandfather, his great-grandfather. This already tells us that the village is very old, and its existence dates back long before the arrival of the Romans. Panoramix, the village druid, is in fact much older than any character in the comic, being 80 years old at the time of Asterix's birth, and taking into account that we know that Asterix in the comic is 35 years old, that would mean that Panoramix by the time of the arrival of the Romans in Gaul would have been around 115 years old, an impressive age, but fun fact, it would still not surpass the person who has lived the longest in the real world, which was a French woman who lived to 122 years old, although of course in our modern times and not during antiquity. So, based on Panoramix's age, we can know that at the very least, the village was protected for at least 100 years by the time of the Romans' arrival, thanks to the magic potion of its druid. And I say protected because while in the comics they portray the Gauls as a federation of united and peaceful Celts who lived in relative peace and harmony among themselves before the arrival of the evil and cruel Romans, in reality we all know that this is far from the truth. In real life, the Gauls did not wait for the Romans to fight and massacre each other, with constant bloodbaths between different Gaul tribes being the norm for those peoples for centuries prior to the Roman arrival. But in the case of Asterix's village, it would have what for that time was the closest thing to a weapon of mass destruction, with the magic potion being able to repel any attack or attempt to destroy his small village and its inhabitants. However, that would not mean that realistically speaking, by the time of Julius Caesar's arrival, the small Gallic village would have been able to conquer and unify all the Gauls under its control due to several factors. The first of these factors is the druid Panoramix's own will regarding how the magic potion is used. The druid is very strict about its use, even highly regulated among the villagers, not allowing them to walk around the village with any magic potion in their hands on a daily basis, except for Asterix, who is the only Gaul that Panoramix trusts enough to use it wisely and responsibly. But the rest of the villagers would only have access to the magic potion in case of defensive need, with Panoramix refusing to give them any magic potion for any reason other than to defend the village and absolutely nothing else. The second factor to take into account is that even assuming that in real life Panoramix would not adopt such a strict position on the method of use of his magic potion, the Gallic village would generally agree to adopt a defensive position and restrict its use as much as possible, since everyone would pragmatically know that if they used the magic potion to adopt an offensive position and start conquering hundreds or even thousands of Gallic tribes throughout Gaul, eventually it would become impossible to keep the secret of the magic potion, and inevitably someone would manage to replicate the recipe of the potion, possibly creating chaos that would lead to a bloody tribal war between different Gaulish factions, which could only be compared to a war worthy of the gods. It is for these two main reasons, more the second than the first, that I think that even in a realistic context where the morality of the characters would be much more questionable and less childish than a children's comic book, that the Gallic village would continue to adopt this isolationist mentality and defensive position towards any outside interaction. For many generations, the Gallic village would only go outside to defend itself from attackers or to find basic resources and to capture and bring with them women from other tribes to their village to continue maintaining the population of the village, which would be very difficult to maintain without having problems of inbreeding due to its isolationist culture. Fortunately, despite the terrible living conditions that would make the villagers look more like a tribe of deformed and monstrous mutants than likable humans in pretty colorful clothes, the magic potion would allow them to survive and endure in that terrible way of life and live on through generations. But speaking of the magic potion, what is the true strength of that potion? How strong can a person become after drinking it? Well, it must be taken into account that the Asterix and Obelix comic book has a light and humorous tone, often featuring feats of strength or achievements that defy all logic, having a logic of power scaling very similar to cartoon characters with toon force. Also, it is important to mention that it is not very relevant to divide the characters' feats of strength between their different continuities, given that the comic book is already very chaotic and without a concrete chronology, and everything can be taken as canon or non-canon at the same time, being totally acceptable to create an amalgamation between its different adaptations to estimate the strength of its characters. And in general, if we don't take into account the cartoonish moments in the comics or movies where characters perform absurdly implausible feats with their toon force logic, and when the actions and feats of strength remain more or less coherent, we can estimate that on average, a person who takes a magic potion could have a strength and speed similar to a character like Spider-Man, that is, being able to lift several tons as if it were only a couple of kilograms, such as lifting trees or knocking down large walls and small buildings, and being able to run at speeds comparable to the fastest animals in the world. With the only exception to those limits described being Obelix, who, having permanently obtained the effects of the magic potion when he was a child, would have a strength far superior to that of any other human by temporarily taking the magic potion, such as partially raising the Great Sphinx of Giza in Egypt, knocking down gigantic constructions such as the Colosseum, or being so fast that he could push ships and gigantic fleets at subsonic speed. If a normal human temporarily taking magic potion would be comparable to Spider-Man, Imagine Obelix having the strength and speed of 10 Spider-Men combined. And if I use the comparison to Spider-Man and not someone like Hulk or Superman, it is for a very good reason, and that is that just like Spider-Man, even though the Gauls with magic potion would be living weapons with their bodies, they would still be vulnerable to many lethal weapons, such as bullets or stabs from swords, spears, or arrows. And I say bullets because although firearms obviously did not exist in antiquity, nor in that comic book either, it is evident that it could kill them, since even an arrow or spear well aimed at a Gaul in his vital parts can injure someone as monstrously strong as Obelix, demonstrating that even soldiers equipped with sharp and highly resistant weapons like those of the Romans could continue to damage humans with magic potion. And as a bonus about what the magic potion can do to a human, it is theorized that the continued use or even abuse of the magic potion could extend a human's lifespan, which would be the main reason why Panoramix, for example, is still alive despite his advanced age, due to constantly taking magic potion to extend his lifespan. In any case, now that we've clarified all those details about the lore of Asterix and Obelix's village, and about the magic potion and its capabilities, but also its limits, we can finally move on to the interesting part of that story, the confrontation between that village and the Romans. Eventually, as in our true history, Julius Caesar would begin his legendary campaign to conquer all of Gaul as we know it. 8 years of brutal conquest that would forever mark Roman history and demonstrate once and for all the power of that republic, just a few decades away from becoming a true empire. In the year 56 BCE, Caesar's legions would march through much of the region of Armorica, where the present-day French region of Brittany is located, and also the place where the comic book's village of Asterix and Obelix is located. During that initial campaign in the region, the Romans, however, would not immediately encounter the Gallic village, since the village was located further north, while the Romans in that initial conquest were more focused on fighting with tribes such as the Veneti. The Romans would obviously hear rumors and stories from the inhabitants of the region, telling them about this mysterious and terrifying Gallic village with fierce warriors who had superhuman strength that was compared to the gods, but the Romans would ignore these rumors, imagining them as local superstitions or desperate attempts by the recently conquered Gallic inhabitants to scare them into withdrawing from the region they had just conquered. In the end, due to the extreme isolation of Asterix and Obelix's village, being far from any urbanization or civilization of any other Gallic tribe or federation, it is highly probable that throughout the course of Julius Caesar's campaign, from its beginning to its end with the siege of Alesia, at no time did Caesar or the rest of his generals confront that village or have the time to take an interest in those strange rumors from other Gauls, which were not taken seriously anyway. However, let us all remember that Caesar won the Gallic Wars by the end of 52 BCE, and the adventures of Asterix and Obelix would take place in the year 50 BCE, and there would still be 2 years before Caesar would leave Gaul to return to Italy and cross the Rubicon. In those 2 years, with the wars with all the Gallic tribes now over, Caesar, his generals, and trusted people could further explore this new Roman territory, first to collect the taxes and compensations that the Romans would generally impose, but also to gather the massive amount of slaves that Caesar gathered in our original timeline, it having been estimated that Caesar exported around 1 million slaves from Gaul in the following 2 years of defeating all the Gauls. Of course, such exploration and harvesting throughout the new province would also be a good opportunity to explore those lands in more detail without having to be prepared to fight to the death constantly, in order to search and estimate which lands would be acceptable to give to Caesar's veterans, or also suitable places to build new cities entirely with Roman infrastructure. And I think it would only be at that moment that the first contacts between the Romans with Asterix and Obelix's village would occur. Initially, a small reconnaissance patrol would attempt to make contact with that mysterious and completely isolated village, but absolutely all of those scouts would be brutally destroyed and annihilated by the Gauls with their magic potion, never returning to the main Roman camps in the area. Eventually, generals and other high-ranking commanders in the area would learn that several patrols of scouts never returned from their outings, and that everything indicated that they disappeared when they were heading to that mysterious village that the local Gauls in the area had told them so much about. Intrigued, but not yet worried, the commander of the area, after Caesar's approval, would deploy an entire legion to investigate that mysterious village and see if those barbarians were still resisting Roman domination or not. Now, while that encounter would certainly be brutal and bloody, we are talking here about a Roman legion, that is to say, a legion composed of around 5,000 men, against a tiny Gallic village with few inhabitants and a serious inbreeding problem due to decades or even centuries of total isolation from the outside world. It's not entirely clear in the comic how many inhabitants the village has, but based loosely on images from the comic and other adaptations, we can roughly estimate that the village has at most just over 100 inhabitants, which is by no means an impressive number. And while that number is only a very rough estimate, the number of warriors ready to fight that village would have is a bit more accurate to estimate, with the images of the warriors attacking, on average, being composed of around 20 to 30 Gallic warriors ready for battle. So yes, we are certainly talking about between 20 to 30 warriors full of magic potion that its effects can last for many hours, accompanied by Obelix, who has those effects permanently and amplified compared to the others, but as I said before, no matter how strong they are still as vulnerable to sharp weapons like spears, swords, or arrows as any other human. So now I want to ask you guys something. How long do you think it would take an army of 5,000 men to manage to stab, by mere chance or distraction, a maximum of 20 to 30 men? Very fast, right? Well, that would be the general idea I have of what a confrontation between those Gauls with a magic potion against a Roman legion would be like. Initially, the Gauls would have the complete and absolute advantage against the Romans, with them probably massacring a Roman cohort in a few seconds in the most brutal and graphic way we can imagine, with a simple punch in the face from a Gaul with magic potion being able to decapitate the head of any Roman, no matter how well protected that one would be with his helmet, and the same applies to a punch or kick to the abdomen, which would be a guarantee of literally spitting all your organs out of your mouth or sphincter, or having the entire arm or leg of the Gaul warrior on the other side of your body. Without a doubt, such brutality and demonstration of superhuman strength on an almost divine scale would initially have a dominating impact on the morale and psychology of any Roman who witnessed such an atrocity. But as I asked earlier, how long would it take before, by some kind of accident or coincidence in the chaos of combat, a Roman would accidentally manage to stab a Gaul with his sword or spear, thereby demonstrating to all the soldiers that although these mutant Gauls were terrifying monsters, they were still just as killable? Again, not very long in my opinion. Once that realization occurred among the Romans, although still terrified of being torn apart or split in half by the mere hands of those monsters, the legion's centurions would quickly regroup and adapt their strategy to attack from the distance and try to avoid a head-on confrontation with those demons. Thanks to this rapid adaptation by the legendary Roman army, plus the help of the Roman auxiliary archers, the few that there were in the legion at least, would quickly be able to briefly turn the battle back in their favor, being able to riddle dozens of Gallic warriors with arrows, weakening them enough to later kill them with a well-thrown spear. This tactic would have been very tedious and stressful for the Romans, but also very effective. However, even with all of that, I am quite convinced that the Gauls would not give up so easily, and their great superhuman speed would allow them to move and dodge many of those arrows. Obelix especially would become the nightmare of the entire Roman legion, being able to move faster than any of his fellow Gauls, being able to dodge many of those arrows, and continuing to massacre several hundred or even thousands more soldiers. Eventually, although the Romans would have managed to kill most of the 20 to 30 Gallic warriors, the strongest ones like Obelix, and the most skilled ones like Asterix, would have still survived, although badly wounded, but having managed to massacre almost the entire Roman legion, with the few hundred legionaries still alive deciding to make a strategic retreat for the time being technically a victory for the Gauls, but clearly a Pyrrhic victory, where although they had won that battle, they won it losing almost all of their men capable of fighting. On both sides, it would have been a traumatic battle with huge losses, but while the Gauls were still alone with themselves to prepare for the imminent return of the Romans could return to their urbanized and secured camps, where the few survivors of the legion that was massacred by the Gauls would have returned traumatized and horrified by that encounter, telling absolutely everything that had happened to other generals and their superiors, finally taking the situation very seriously, and once again asking for advice from the other Gauls in the region who had already told them those strange stories about that Gallic village. Thanks to the information that other Gallic peoples had given to the Romans, as they had known about that village for centuries, They would know that these demons, with a strength worthy of the gods, were nothing more than savages dependent on a druid and his mysterious magic potion that gave them that incredible strength. But seeing that despite their incredible and terrifying abilities, they were still capable of being killed with sharp weapons, the Roman camp base in the region would send a message to Julius Caesar to inform him of the entire situation. Caesar was probably in southern Gaul at the time, very close to deciding to cross the Rubicon or not. Caesar was surprised and somewhat skeptical of the incredible and terrifying stories they would tell him, but he did nonetheless take them seriously. After all, these stories would be received by his most faithful and loyal generals, who did not hesitate to go to the trouble of going to investigate the entire situation in northwestern Gaul, taking 3 Roman legions with him for the occasion. Caesar would decide to go with his legions also because of the extreme curiosity he had for that mysterious magic potion. If the stories of his generals were true, then, if he could obtain the recipe of that magic potion, he could completely dominate the Roman Senate and Pompey without any problem, he would think. Arriving there after a few months, Caesar would quickly reorganize the Roman camp to prepare for the attack and siege of the village if necessary, but of course, he would have to do everything possible to keep the druid who was preparing the magic potion alive. And so, the 3 legions that Caesar brought with him, plus a 4th legion that was already stationed in the region, would head back toward that cursed village, with all the soldiers, although disciplined and brave, unable to help but tremble with terror at the prospect of confronting those demons by whom their comrades were massacred months before. The Gauls of the village, learning that the Romans were going to attack very soon, would prepare for the final battle that would mark their destinies forever, willing to fight to the last before a Roman destroyed their village or captured Panoramix to force him to give them the recipe for the magic potion. Although most of the men would have died in the previous battle, in the Asterix and Obelix comic, it is not uncommon in times of extreme crisis for even the women to come out to fight to defend the village, with now the women and a few surviving men like Asterix and Obelix being the last ones capable of doing whatever it takes to defend the village and the few children who lived there, besides the druid, of course. But once again, the outcome would be a matter of absolute numerical superiority. How long would it take for 4 Roman legions of 5,000 men each to have the luck or chance to land an arrow or spear in a vital part of the Gauls' bodies and their women? The outcome would be even worse than in the previous battle in a very short time. No matter how many hundreds or even thousands and thousands of soldiers the Gauls would tear to pieces, the number would be so abysmally superior to their own that inevitably they would all end up dead by arrows, by spears, by lucky stabs with swords of a very brave Roman soldier, or simply by the effects of the magic potion wearing off. One thing is for sure, even with all the Gauls dying, the last one standing would be Obelix, who would fight like a true berserker beast until his last breath, with adrenaline allowing him to endure having a ton of arrows, spears, and swords passing through his body, being a brutal and bestial killing machine that would terrify all the Romans. Recently, there has been a curious debate on the internet about whether 100 men could kill a gorilla or not. Although the answer is not entirely clear, one thing is certain: if 100 men couldn't kill a gorilla, then undoubtedly thousands of men with armor and sharp weapons could kill a gorilla, regardless of how many men it would have killed before falling. And I think that is what would happen to Obelix, being the last Gaul to fall, and the one who will have caused the greatest number of losses on the part of the Romans, perhaps having been able to single-handedly destroy an entire legion before finally falling. After that brutal and monstrous battle that perhaps would have lasted a whole day, and where at least half of Caesar's army would have died in situations and circumstances worthy of the worst nightmares from the gods themselves, Caesar still would not waste time, and would immediately enter the Gallic village with the rest of his soldiers still alive to find the druid Panoramix as soon as possible and capture him before he could escape. Panoramix would be quickly found, captured, and imprisoned, removed from his home and all his mysterious potions and personal preparations to prevent any kind of magic trick by him, or even taking the magic potion itself to defend himself. Although, having prepared all he could of magic potion for the last battle of the Gauls, it is likely that in any case, he would no longer have a drop of magic potion left to save him by that point. In the case of the children from the village, normally the Romans would capture them to sell them as slaves, but on this exceptional occasion, due to superstitions and fear of what those children could perhaps do, or if they had some magic potion hidden somewhere, they would all be executed as a precaution, ending up by completely razing to the ground and destroying that cursed village, with the only survivor being Panoramix the druid, now a prisoner of the Romans. After all these events, and now truly having all of Gaul under Roman control for real, of course the first thing Caesar would do would be to force Panoramix to reveal the recipe for the magic potion and teach them how to prepare it, with Caesar being ready to apply all kinds of terrible and extremely painful tortures to the druid. A moment like that in the original Asterix and Obelix comic book would have been portrayed with great courage and optimism, given the mental strength of a noble druid who would refuse, until his death, to reveal the secret of the magic potion to the Romans. But in the real world, no one has the willpower strong enough to endure indescribable physical and mental torture forever, especially with the Romans being the ones torturing, who, as many of us know, were experts at devising the best possible torture techniques of antiquity, and perhaps in all of human history in general. Now, this is the moment in which this alternate scenario would split into two branches, which, depending on the outcome, would affect or not affect the rest of human history. The first and most boring branch would be that, as a result of the terrible tortures Panoramix had experienced, and due to his weak body and advanced age, he would end up dying accidentally before he could have revealed any secrets to the Romans about his magic potion. If that was the case, then Caesar would resign himself to one day obtaining the secret of that magic potion, regretting that lost opportunity to obtain such power, and subsequently he would cross the Rubicon to begin his control over the Roman Republic against Pompey, and the rest of the events of all of human history as we know it would follow their course just as in our real timeline. The only difference being that the story of some weird Gauls having a magic potion that would have given them superhuman strength and that would have destroyed multiple Roman legions in brutal ways with their bare hands would have been a story passed down among the Romans throughout the centuries until reaching us, with modern historians considering it as a mythological tale or a lie that was part of Caesar's propaganda to make his conquest of the Gauls even more impressive, but nothing more. Now, the second branch of that story, and the most interesting of course, would be the branch in which Panoramix survives his tortures long enough to finally give in and agree to give the magic potion recipe to the Romans. Then Panoramix would be forced, under extremely high surveillance, to prepare the magic potion in front of Caesar and a few other generals of Caesar's highly trusted men such as Mark Antony, and then Caesar would force multiple Roman volunteers to test the magic potion to make sure that the druid had not poisoned the potion or slightly changed the formula to have unwanted side effects when taken. And after many successful attempts, and seeing that even after hours of the potion's effect having passed, all the volunteer Romans were perfectly fine and without any apparent health problems, Caesar would finally be happy that he had truly obtained such an enormous power like that one of the magic potion, immediately killing Panoramix after being sure of having all the necessary information about the magic potion, its effects, limits, and of course, formula. And just in time, because probably the obtention of the magic potion would occur around the same time in which Caesar would finally leave for Italy to cross the Rubicon and start his civil war with Pompey to take the absolute control of Rome, but in this alternate timeline, Caesar would not only return with legions loyal to him for the riches and successes that he would have brought to them in Gaul, but also with the secret of a magic potion that would give him the possibility of truly imitating the strength of the gods themselves, a potion that he would take for his personal use, ensuring that absolutely no one will be able to stop him in his rise to power. But for now, this is where we'll stop with this crazy alternate scenario. If the video is successful enough by reaching the goal of 1,000 likes, then I'll continue the story where the Romans would now have the famous magic potion from Asterix and Obelix, creating a completely crazy future different from the one we know. Once we reach that goal, I'll announce the sequel in the channel's community post, so stay tuned for that. Therefore, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of it. And without anything else to say, see you next time!